Thank you so much for coming and joining us tonight. We have food, as you've seen, so feel free to grab seconds and thirds, and we just appreciate your time. We've been working on climate resiliency planning for the last couple of years with grant funding, and we're trying to make sure that as we're planning and understanding risks of climate change, like flooding and heat, how that's impacting our critical assets. We want to make sure that we're continuing to come back to our communities and understand how this resonates with our residents and our businesses. I want to thank our elected officials for joining us tonight, Mayor Kyles from South Bay and Mayor Wilson from Belle Glade. I think it speaks really volumes that we have our electeds amongst our residents, because this is important work in understanding how we should be planning for our future. So we're going to go through some of our preliminary results. We are going to have Georgia and Aaron Dede present on some of these findings. We're going to have, at the very end, Nathan from our Transportation Planning Agency give a little bit of an update on some of his work, because transportation is integral for how a community operates. So we're happy to have him as our sneak surprise guest appearance. And I just want to emphasize, we have an unincorporated Palm Beach County and Glades scope for this project, but we want it, when we do our community workshops, we prioritize 2 of the 3 locations to be within the Glades community, because we know that it's important, that it's part of how we want to be focusing our efforts. So again, just really appreciate you coming here and your time and your insight. And I will turn it over to Georgia for now. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Georgia Vince. I'm with a company called Tetra Tech, and we have a pretty large team of consultants that is supporting this effort. It includes Aaron Dede, PA. She'll be speaking this evening. We have Brizaga helping with our IT and our outreach. Also, S.A. Nelson, Tammy, and Sophia are here to make sure that you all are engaged with our efforts. We also use a couple of other small firms that are not here tonight, Clearview Geographic and Chen Moore Associates, to help get the project going. As Megan mentioned, our focus for this climate assessment is the Glades communities out here in Western Palm Beach County and also unincorporated Palm Beach County. Our goal tonight is to get as much feedback from you as possible about our preliminary results, any other concerns that you may have. So we're going to do a couple of things tonight. So if y'all have a cell phone, we'll be taking some live surveys with the audience. So just have your cell phone out. We're going to go to a website called menti.com, and you'll be able to type in your answers live here in the room. So we'll be able to incorporate that into our results of our report. We'll also, at the end of the presentation, you'll see posters around the room. We'll be sitting with you and talking with you, answering any questions specific to Belle Glade, Pahokee, South Bay, or any of the evaluations that we've been working on. So we'll be here until 8 o'clock and look forward to talking with you and getting your input, feedback, and answering all of your questions. So our agenda tonight, Aaron's going to talk about the project, kind of give you all the background and what we've been doing. We'll talk about preliminary results. We'll talk about the next steps, what we're going to be doing next. We'll do a quick question and answer session. And then again, we'll be doing this community workshop. So please stick around to the end so we can interact with you and have a whole lot of really good conversations. I'll hand it over to Aaron.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming this evening and online. Thank you for tuning in to us. Just to give you a quick overview of this project, the Palm Beach County, you'll see the word CRA, that stands for Community Risk Assessment, has been funded both by the federal government and the state of Florida through grants. So this is not costing the taxpayers of Palm Beach County or any of you any money. This is funded by other sources of dollars, which is great. And so what we are doing is addressing climate risks that we know are happening now and are going to be happening in the future, primarily flood risks. But Georgia is going to talk about some of the other environmental hazards that we're going to see. For instance, with too much water and too much flooding, you also have heat impacts that we're going to talk about this evening. And so what the project is aiming to do is prepare the county through policies and projects and potentially program recommendations to help mitigate some of that risk and make the community more resilient or able to bounce back from these types of climate stressors. So we are working in the communities. We're trying to develop good contacts and good communications with people by having these meetings where you are, and making sure that we have diverse stakeholders. We've also invited and had several targeted meetings with the staffs of the different communities of the different municipalities to make sure that we're collecting all of the right information and the assets. So we want to make sure that we're balancing that really good science and technical input with also community input at the same time. The project also prioritizes social equity and climate justice. So we're going to be doing some mapping and evaluation on some of those socioeconomic factors that may mean that certain areas of your community are exacerbated by climate risks and flooding. For instance, elderly populations or people where you have challenges with English as a second language. That means that we have to communicate these types of threats and risks in a different way. And so the idea is that we're going to be developing strategies, and the whole point of having a plan is having projects in a queue that we can seek other grant dollars and we can figure out what our funding priorities are. So plan, technical information, plan of attack, and then potential funding opportunities associated with it. So we're looking at these different types of climate risks and what those impacts are in Palm Beach County. As you'll see, this was the first time I saw that heat map over there. And it's kind of interesting because you see, downtown West Palm where it's very developed and very dense, and that's the higher concentration in area of heat impact compared to the rest of the county. So the point is that we have to assess these risks because they're not going to be the same throughout the county. We've got a big county that's very diverse. We've got a lot of natural systems, and we've got low elevation areas and higher elevation areas. So we have to look at all of that to determine what those risks are. Evaluate the impacts from the various climate stressors that Georgia is going to talk about. We're also looking at today's conditions, how these stressors impact us today and how they might impact us in the future. For instance, the science tells us that the sea levels are rising. So over on the coast, that's going to be an issue. But we're also seeing higher intense rainfall events. If anybody that was out this weekend knows that it's kind of a weird time of the year to have a big torrential downpour like that. They're already making releases from Lake Okeechobee, which is an interesting time of the year to be doing that. And that's because we have so much wet weather. And then we'll also be looking at the other extreme for drought and how that may impact potential water supply and other things like that. So what we want to do is we're pulling your information from your communities about the different assets. You're going to hear that word a lot. Assets are generally things that are publicly owned, like your roads and your buildings, that type of thing. And then we will prioritize how we respond to these risks. And so our ultimate goal is to develop what's called a resilience action plan. There'll be one final document that'll assimilate all of this information together. And this will, again, be countywide in scope, and it will offer some of these adaptation strategies. So that's kind of a mouthful. Adaptation strategies are projects to respond to the risks that we find. And so we will have a prioritized list of those. And then finally, all of these things, we will consider different policy responses as well. For instance, land use planning and how we invest in infrastructure and public health policies and programs as well. So the risks that are being evaluated are coastal erosion. That will have an impact a certain distance from the coast as sea levels rise. We'll be looking at drought periods of where we have a deficit of rainfall, extreme heat where we have, those high heat days of, 95, 97, 100 degrees in succession. That's a real challenge. We're also going to be looking at just flooding that is not from sea level rise, but rainfall flooding, where you have low areas of the community or you have older stormwater infrastructure that may become overwhelmed by rainfall events. And then you see the flooding on your roads and in your yards and that type of thing. Severe storms, tornadoes, hurricanes, high wind, wildfire is a threat that we'll be looking at as well. And then all different types of flooding, what I like to call the mashup scenario, where you have different types of flood risks that are happening simultaneously, and they create a harsher impact for those that are in that area. So this program really wants us to focus on those assets. The state requires us to look at 4 different types of assets. We have to look at your transportation systems, bridges. I saw one of the bridges out there to Torrey Island that was identified as a critical asset. We look at your infrastructure, which is your stormwater, your water supply delivery system, your wastewater systems. We look at critical community and emergency facilities, which are buildings, schools, healthcare facilities, hospitals, things that maybe aren't owned by the local government, but they're still important to the functionality of your community. And then we look at historic, cultural, and natural resources as well, because those are an important asset. Your green infrastructure is just as important as any other infrastructure. And so I'm going to turn it over to Georgia. And so if you take out your phone, you can scan the code there, and the questions will start to come up, and Georgia will kind of walk you through how Menti will use that to kind of get some live feedback. It's kind of fun when you see the results coming in right before your eyes.
So yeah, so you can either go to menti.com on like a Safari app on your any web browser on your phone, or you can scan the code. And then when you get there, it's going to ask you to enter the code for this survey, which is 694-32922. So if you, I'll give you all a couple minutes to get that code and get your phones ready. And then we're going to run through our first question of the night to get your feedback. I hope that Aaron, I think Aaron did a great job kind of giving you an overview of what we'll be looking at. So we're going to ask you a couple of questions. So if you didn't get the code, it is still on the top of the screen. The first question for you that we have today is, which populations would you consider most at risk to the effects of climate hazards? Is it homeless? Is it the elderly? Is it children, agricultural workers, or another group of folks that you think are most at risk? And you know, this could be from heat, it could be from flooding, it could be from any of the hazards that Aaron discussed. And we're really just, and you can answer live right now, so you can start answering the question surveys while we're here in the room, and the answers should pop up on the screen. There we go. So as you can see, homeless is a big, is the number 1 at the moment. And if other people continue to answer, we'll get some changes to the responses. Looks like we had 10 responses. So I think that's about everybody in the room. Does anybody need more time, or everybody's good? All right, we'll go on to the next question. I think. Whoops. All right. So as we mentioned, we've been out to the community a couple of times out here in Western Palm Beach County. And one of the hazards that has come up repeatedly from the public is extreme heat and concerns about the heat. Now, maybe that was because it was summertime when we were here last time, but heat is obviously, I think everybody who lives in Florida has recognized that we are seeing higher temperatures than we have in the past. And so our analysis looks at, you know, where we're seeing more extreme heat. And so this is data that's collected from the Trust for Public Land. And this is a map of Belle Glade. I have the big map that shows the entire county, but the darker pink areas represent areas that have recorded higher temperatures than average. So these are areas that have, you know, have experienced more heat than others in the last 30 years. So areas that are considered not at risk are not exposed. So you'll see that a lot of the farm fields are considered not exposed. But we have classified this climate hazard with high, medium, and low. So the colorations kind of correspond with high, medium, and low. This graph shows exposure rates that tend to increase where there's less or more developed land and less natural lands. So you'll see the red is the highest percentage of the land exposed or the highest heat. And then orange is medium and yellow is low. And this graph, I don't think you can see, but the first bar is West Palm Beach. The second one is Belle Glade. The third one is South Bay. Then we have Jupiter and Pahokee. And so the columns show the populations that are exposed to these heat levels, and the line shows the percent of land that is exposed to these heat levels. And that's just a comparison. Again, just kind of explaining the level of heat exposure that we are experiencing. We also looked at wildfires, and the good news is I think most of the areas are low exposure to wildfires. If I didn't bring the giant map, but we do have a full-size county-size map of all the wildfire exposure. And really, it comes down to the natural areas. And obviously, they have the most fuel for the fires. And the areas adjacent to those natural lands are going to be the medium and lower risks. So we are going to ask another question. If you get your phones out and go to menti.com and hit that code, what heat adaptation strategies would benefit your community the most? Oops. And so the first one is increase tree canopy in areas with shade, create cooling centers, home improvements like air conditioning or insulation and better roofs, improve access to medical attention for heat exhaustion or education and awareness. So what things do you think would benefit your community the most? So we have, and I think this one you can put in more than one answer. Anybody else giving us answers? Can you guys see it on the screen? Okay, good. Looks like we only have one person answering. No, there's more? Oh. We're getting it in the back. All right, we will, we are getting more data. It's just not showing up on the screen. So we will move on. And my PowerPoint presentation will not freeze. Oop. We got a timer on. Oh, why is it doing that? All right. Oh, there we go. We're going now. All right. Now we got everybody's answers. Thank you so much. Hopefully my screen will move forward. Okay, so we talked a little bit on the last slide about cooling stations, and they also are called climate resiliency hubs. It's a concept that's been developed and is starting to be implemented around the state of Florida to provide areas where residents can go and get water and get cooled down and have some time away from the exposure to the sun and the extreme heat. So we wanted to know if there was a place that you would suggest putting one of these cooling stations. So we have listed places of worship, libraries, community centers, recreational facilities, or other, where you think you would go to if you needed to get cooled down. And we can, if we have some good ideas, the county could focus on providing those or enhancing those facilities to become resiliency hubs. Yep, the answers, you should be able to answer the question now live on the menti.com. If you go to menti.com and put in the code, that's at the top of the screen. Oops. Got 5 likes. It's going. It's not going live. All right. All right, 14 answers. Great job. So let's talk a little bit about flooding. Inland flooding is, basically, I think we all know what inland flooding is, when water pools up on the land due to extreme precipitation rates. We did an inland flooding evaluation looking into the future to 2040 for the 100-year and 24-hour rainfall event. We looked at land and population similar to the wildfires, and we will be looking at the effects of those flooding events on critical assets. And if you don't know, the 100-year, 24-hour flood event is the amount of rainfall expected during an event that has at least 1% chance of occurring every year. And I think those numbers are going up. So this graph shows, obviously the percent of land that's exposed to inland flooding. And as we all know here in Florida, it's a big percentage of our land. It is also a big percentage of our population that is exposed to inland flooding. And so this graph kind of compares a few different municipalities. The first one is Pahokee, then Belle, Glade, South Bay, unincorporated Palm Beach County, Jupiter, Boynton, and West Palm Beach. So we take all this information about where on the landscape the effects are happening related to flooding or heat or wildfires. And then we look at if there is an aggregation of critical assets that's exposed. So do we have county or owned assets, or do we have community assets that are exposed to those risks? And if there's a congregation or aggregation of those assets, then at what exposure, to what are they exposed? So how bad are they exposed to the risk? These areas called hotspots may be subject to sea level rise, storm surge, rainfall, or a combination of any of those risks. And we're looking into the future to 2040 and 2070. So critical assets are those identified, also can be those identified by you as community stakeholders that we need to evaluate and bring into our program. So the hotspots are going to help prioritize where adaptation response should occur. And so there's in the back of the room, there's a poster about the Belle Glade, specific to Belle Glade hotspots. And then I have a couple handouts up here in the front of the room that we can share with you during the workshop that talk about what critical assets have been identified in your hotspots. So the front of the page has a map, and the back of the page has the list of assets that we've identified in those hotspots. So in Palm Beach County, for our overall study, we've identified 25 hotspots throughout the county and unincorporated Palm Beach County and the western communities. And this is one of the maps for Belle, Glade, and you can see there's 19, 20, 21, and 22 are the hotspots where they're more exposed to flooding risk. And then the little icons show substations, public schools, mobile home parks, fire stations, EMS, etc. We have done the same for the city of Pahokee, and we have done the same for South Bay. And so, like I said, the Belle Glade and South Bay maps are up here in the front of the room, and we can pass those out and talk about them at the end of the meeting during the workshop. Sure, Tammy's coming up to take care of that for you. So we want to make sure that these hotspots accurately reflect your local knowledge of flood-prone areas. We have been looking at other studies that have been done in the areas. So we've looked at other stormwater master plans and modeling efforts that have happened to kind of come up with, the most affected areas within the city. And the good news is, yes, most people agree that these are the correct hotspots for the towns. Let me see what's in the chat. All right. Thanks, Tammy. Okay. This is the list of the assets within the Belle Glade hotspots. It's on the handout, and the list is on the back. It does include schools, mobile home parks, fire rescue stations, and other emergency response facilities, and an electrical substation, along with multiple historic structures. As Aaron mentioned, the asset inventory that the state of Florida asks us to review does include natural, cultural, and historic resources. So several of those are on the list. So what are we going to do with all this information? Once we finalize our critical asset list for each of the communities and all the 25 hotspots, we'll look at those assets and identify mechanisms to adapt to the risks. So hoping to mitigate the risks to that asset, making it more resilient over time. This could include flood proofing or wet proofing a building, raising electrical equipment so that the mechanical stuff can still operate during a flooding event. We'll look at green and nature-based solutions that could be restoring habitat, or maybe like a living shoreline project. We'll look at community education and outreach programs, making sure everybody's aware of the risks that are out there. We'll coordinate with the emergency management planners to make sure they are aware of the risks and are prepared to adapt to those. And then we'll be looking at policy, land use codes, and guidelines in the comp plan to make sure they will, over the long term, continue to keep us safe. So the next Menti question is, what adaptation strategies do you want the county to do more of by 2050 to address future flooding risks? This one is specific to flooding. So more stormwater management, more elevation and retrofitting, update codes and policies, or restore natural areas. All right, you guys, thanks so much for your answers. They aren't showing on the screen, but they are showing in our database in the back. So hopefully they will pop up.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about elevator?
Sure. It could include roads, elevating roads, but a lot of times it has to do with moving the electrical equipment above flood levels. So pump stations won't operate if their mechanical equipment is flooded with water. So we can retrofit that pump station to have the mechanical equipment or the generator on the top so that it's not getting flooded and can continue to operate. There they go. All right. Well, thank you for your responses. It looks like we have a tie between stormwater management and elevate and retrofit. Oh, we'll continue to get responses. We'll start it over if we need to. So we just wanted to give you a high level explanation of where we are in our schedule. We did our last round of public workshops in 2023. We're continuing to do public workshops in 2024. We hope to have our draft vulnerability assessment and climate risk assessment in April. And then we'll be doing our final risk assessment in June with another round of public workshops with our final results, identifying projects and the adaptation strategies for those projects in July. And then from there, we'll work on our resiliency action plan. We'll have more public workshops in 2025 to inform you of all of that work. And then by December of 2025, we will have our resiliency action plan that we will help. We look forward to helping the county implement those projects through grant funding opportunities and the like. Yeah, the projects, the county's doing a lot of work though, so not everything's waiting until the end of 2025, but the projects that we're identifying will be in the next grant cycle and will be the implementation plan will be completed, which will be all encompassing for Palm Beach County. So our next steps will complete the exposure and sensitivity analysis for the climate hazards. We'll get our final critical asset list. We'll prepare the climate risk assessment report and again, come back with you with all of our results. We will be having a GIS mapping tool and data dashboard. So anybody can go into the database or into the dashboard to look at all of the results live at any time you like. So that'll be coming out later this year. And then I'll hand it back to Megan to wrap up the presentation.
Thank you all. So we wanted to update the group with some good news in case you haven't heard. Maybe a year or two, we were at one of these workshops and we're listening to our community with a different consultant, Jamie Lee Bradshaw from Community Partners of South Florida. Some of you might have been there. And we were hearing, what does the community need? What are people looking for? And tree canopy coverage came up as an issue, right? I think in Belle, Glade, Pahokee, South Bay, tree canopy coverage is less than 10%, which makes it less comfortable to go to a park and walk and be outside and wait for the bus. So we heard that feedback. We saw a good opportunity and we applied for an EPA, Environmental Protection Agency federal grant and received $1 million to expand tree canopy in the Glades region. So we're going to be focusing on increasing trees at 6 county parks and then having resident tree giveaways throughout throughout our neighborhoods here. So I think it's going to be like a couple thousand trees for residents. We're going to include fruit-bearing trees for people who are interested in growing food on their own property, as well as Florida-friendly native shade producers. So we're excited to get that going in the next few months. I know sometimes when we see the calendars, we're like 2025, we need to do things now. So this is one of those examples of what we're working on now. And I think we can use this group, people who come to these meetings, to help communicate and share that news with our residents here. So really happy to provide that update. And then in closing, before I turn it over to Nathan for the Transportation Planning Agency updates, I do want to thank you and encourage you to stick around after so you can look through the posters. I know we had the online participation, but if something's not resonating, if something doesn't sit right with what you just saw, come talk to me, come talk to Georgia, ask questions. This is your time, so it's important that it's valuable to you. This is not for us. We need to hear what you have to say and what you're thinking in response to what we've just presented. So I will turn it over. I want to wait. Yeah, okay, great. I'm going to turn it back to Georgia.
Okay.
That's what I'm doing. All right, thank you.
Yep. So just, we do have a couple other community workshops coming up. Next week we'll be in, unincorporated Palm Beach County at the Westgate Community Center. And then we'll be back in Pahokee on March 13th. So, we hope to see you there. Feel free to come. We'll present a lot of similar information, but it may be a little bit, different based on the location. So on top, in addition to the Menti survey, we do have 2 online surveys. One is a climate change survey, which asks you a lot of questions about what climate change effects you're experiencing. And then we have a flooding survey where you can actually go in and enter in a location where you're experiencing a flooding or regularly experience flooding. So those are 2 important surveys that we're doing right now. And those your responses can be entered into those at any time. So that's the last thing that I wanted to say for that. And we just really wanted to thank you for your participation. It is really important to get community feedback and input, and we certainly want your buy-in on this process and the project. So thank you so much for your time.